Okay, so I'm going to cover my talk, A Day in the Life of an Open Source Maintainer. So just a bit of introduction. So I'm a maintainer on FluentBit. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. My talk is mainly about trying to encourage contribution in open source using some examples from FluentBit. But I thought I'd give a little bit of a background into FluentBit and kind of what it is in case people haven't heard of it. If you're using a public cloud, you will be using FluentBit somewhere in the stack. It might be called something slightly different, observability agent, or some other rebranded version. But it's a fairly mature CNCF graduated project, started back in 2014, all written in C. The idea being to take disparate input sources, do some processing on them, and send them to whatever output you want to do. So it supports different vendors, different destinations, OTel, all that kind of stuff. So it collects logs, metrics, and traces, lets you do some processing on them, and then send them to various different outputs. So you tend to see use cases where you want to do maybe send some stuff to a SIEM or an S3, also to Loki and stuff like that. So it's vendor agnostic and CNCF. Some introductions. So I work for Calyptra, so we're the maintainers of all the Fluent projects. So there's FluentD as well, which people may also have heard of. Obviously FluentBit, there's the Fluent operator, which is about deploying FluentD or FluentBit in Kubernetes space. And we build enterprise solutions on top. So we provide some sort of LTS versions, but we also do there's some SaaS hosted projects and things along those lines. But I'm not really here to sell Calyptra, but they did fund me, so it'd be great if we can get some business. So I am quite old. I have been doing software engineering for 22 years now, primarily defense. So I spent 15, 16 years in defense, doing C++ and Java, working my way up from software engineer, but mostly around infrastructure and platform deployments. And then more recently, containers, so convincing the Navy to switch over to containers and Kubernetes, and then using Golang operators, those kind of deployments as well. So, the goals for this project, for this talk. The main thing I want to get out of this talk for people is to encourage contribution. So try and encourage contribution in open source projects, get more people, more companies to contribute to it. How you can raise issues, do PRs, whatever it is you want to contribute. I want to also kind of highlight the I don't want to say technical, but the non-sort of implementing features or doing bug fixes kind of contribution. There's lots of other stuff we need in the open source world. Documentation, tests, CI/CD, even just resources to run things on. So compute, time, effort, those kind of things as well. So I kind of wanted to highlight some of those things which may not be the kind of areas people feel like they can contribute to, but they're very easy to get into. Documentation particularly is a great area to start with. Doing some answering of questions, community engagement, blogs, all this kind of stuff is contribution. Spreading the word, helping people out using open source projects, that's contribution. So making the community better. And as part of that as well, so in this talk as well, I've picked out a few examples of benefits for enterprise. Why should companies contribute? Why should they pay their employees to do it? I mean, if you're consuming open source, you're kind of reliant on it, so you kind of want it to be good as well. But also the non-direct benefits you can get from contributing as well to open source. And also, one of my favorite subjects, talking about myself. So that's really good. So I'm happy to be here talking about myself. FluentBit a little bit as well. Yeah, I can talk about that too. If you want to learn some more, come find me and stuff like that as well. For me as well, I've only done open source maintenance for 2 years now. So my sort of career timeline hasn't been kind of what you'd expect of an open source developer. I worked in defense for a very long time. We used open source. We didn't really contribute to it very much. But anyone can contribute at any point in their life, even approaching retirement like myself. And the other thing, I'm pretty terrified of approaching people, networking, one-on-one discussions. Happy to talk here. But please, afterwards, come find me, come talk to me. Let's talk about stuff. Doesn't have to be anything technical. It can just be, why Manchester is much better than London. Things like that. So also, I live in Manchester. So my journey over the years. So I graduated in 2002, started working at Thales, underwater systems. So we made sonar systems for the Navy, submarines, surface ships, and helicopters. Then, after doing graduate development scheme, which at Thales was pretty good, I felt like I wanted to move to a smaller company, experience something smaller whilst I was early on in my career. So I started working for a quite small company in Manchester that then subcontracted to UIQ and Sony Ericsson, and we did mobile phone development on the Symbian platform, if anyone remembers that. Making cleanup stack explicitly in code. Fun times. I hope I never do it again. Then back to Thales in 2007, started working in essentially an infrastructure team. We provided a platform for every project in UK, France, and Australia to deploy everything from bare metal upwards on lots of different platforms. So essentially, we came up with service-oriented architecture, sort of something like containers, something like Kubernetes, a load of service discovery stuff, monitoring, all that. We solved all the same problems, just with some open source software, and then the orchestrator was tended to be very bespoke. And then later on, transitioned a lot of this to containers and Kubernetes. It solves the same problem, a slightly different way, but much more standard, getting it, integrating other tools very easy if you're using industry standard tools. I got frustrated eventually with convincing old people in suits who like to buy submarines that they need to buy Kubernetes instead. So I moved to working at Couchbase, which is a database company. They've got quite a big site in Manchester. They've got one down here in London as well, actually. So my focus there was I wanted to work in Golang. I wanted to do Kubernetes development. I wanted to, try and work in those areas. So I started working in the cloud native team, making the Kubernetes operator for Couchbase. And one of my first jobs was to add observability to Couchbase. Couchbase came about before Kubernetes, so its container deployment was multi-process. So it was quite large. It didn't really follow the traditional observability approaches that Kubernetes followed. So I added a FluentBit sidecar to it, and this is where I first started interacting with the community, talking to people. I did a few blog posts on my experiences. A lot of the key questions that people have when they're first starting to use FluentBit, those kind of things. I think so. The founders of Calyptra, so the maintainers of the FluentBit stuff, got frustrated with me just raising questions and problems, and basically offered me a job to come and actually fix those problems at Calyptra and implement things and use my experience there. And so my job at Calyptra, I'm head of infrastructure, but also I spend a lot of time on the open source side, mostly from a user perspective. So I don't implement features in FluentBit. I've done a lot of the DevOps, I've done a lot of the CI/CD aspects, but generally speaking, it's about I want to do, I want to use FluentBit in this way. How can we expose it nicely? How can we make the UX for the users very straightforward? So I'm very much, I guess, a user advocate, those kind of things. Like, it's really easy to make some really cool feature that does something wonderful, but impossible to use. So it's about taking that aspect of open source. Right, so I spent a little bit of time breaking down how much time I wasted. I spent on work in a typical day, specifically on open source. So I wouldn't spend a whole day on open source. This is kind of breaking down the hours I do each week and on open source and what I'm spending them on. I spend a horrendous amount of time on Slack. There's quite an active Slack community for FluentBit, and it's the first point of call for a lot of stuff. So it's quite a good space if you want to go and just discuss your problems and maybe help a few people out. There's a lot of people who can contribute with Slack because their company doesn't let them contribute code or documentation directly, but they can answer questions in Slack. So I spend quite a bit of time on Slack. There's a lot of interaction there. I quite enjoy it. I do generally do it while my code's compiling, so while I'm waiting for other things to build or something like that. So you can spend a couple of minutes just going through questions. I then spend a bit of time iterating through the latest issues and discussions on the FluentBit repo. Quite often, the response is, have you tried it with the latest version? Can you give us some more information? So kind of triaging those kind of issues and discussions, which is quite useful. Maybe trying to reproduce some of the issues if there's enough information there as well, to try and help out the actual developers working on it. Do a bit of PR contributions, review. I spent a lot of work when I first started revamping the release process and stuff like that, which is now ticking over quite nicely. So generally speaking, my PR contributions are just to review stuff, make sure it builds with all the targets. Quite often people will add this jazzy new feature, but we have to support everything from Raspbian, CentOS 7, CentOS 6 for some of our enterprise stuff, all the way across to Windows and Mac as well. So it can break in weird and wonderful ways. So we've got a lot of CI/CD around just making sure it builds and trying to run some tests on it. Triggering a release. So releases are fully automated now. They didn't used to be. But there's still a manual gate as to when we actually want to pull the trigger on pushing a release out the door. So I got the opportunity at KubeCon to do a release on my phone at dinner with my boss, who was I think it was a good advert for my work so far on it, because up to that point he was the one doing releases manually, doing builds on particular servers, build machines, those kind of things. And it would take him upwards of 2-3 days to get a release out. So the fact I could do it on my phone and just press go on GitHub, it was quite good. Also spent a bit of time maybe doing some blog posts, doing a conference presentation, training webinars as well. We do a few of those, quite like those. They're quite interesting, get to interact with people. I've done a few meetups and community days, done OpenShift ones at this down in London as well a few times. Done some stuff with customers. Last week I was out in Madrid, working with some customers, solving some problems. Again, it's about how can we take FluentBit to do this very specific workflow and solve these problems, which I find quite interesting. More like consultancy sometimes. Book reviews. So this is a new one on me. Never done a book review before, but managed to do one the last couple of weeks. Phil Wilkins, so he's an Oracle developer advocate. I think he's done a few things with CNCF as well. He's writing a book, so he wanted me to review some of the technical content on FluentBit. And community meetings as well. I like talking to people at community meetings and forcing them to talk to me sometimes. So I think I forced Steve to talk to me, for example, a few times. Okay, so I spend a lot of time on my Slack and community interactions, but I wanted to highlight this as something that maybe you guys, anyone can do. We have a few users on Slack who work at organizations where they can't contribute anything directly without lots of paperwork. I used to work at one of those organizations. There's ways around it, but yeah, it can be quite difficult. But you can help other people out. If you've solved a problem before, or you know what it might be, you can point them in the right direction. And a lot of the stuff you get asked is generally common themes. There's a lot of stuff about breaking down problems, divide and conquer, figure out where the problem is. You get quite a lot of problems like, I've got FluentBit here, and then I've got a million things on top of it with, Kibana or Grafana at the end. This isn't right at the end, and it's like, well, figure out which bit's broken, and let's narrow the problem down. And also, you tend to see the first visibility, particularly of infrastructure problems, like, say, if you forget to pay your DNS bill. But also some other very weird problems, which I'll touch on in a minute. And there's lots of engagement there. So there's our Slack, but for me, this slide was more about encouraging contribution via community interactions. You don't have to make code, you don't have to write docs, just talk work in the community, start meeting people. It's quite good to do that. And you might get a job out of it as well. So yeah, all good. Right, so I'm going to touch on a couple of problems that we've had, and focus maybe on the enterprise benefits, the kind of why people should do this. So we had a very weird problem with reported, because we have so many very old targets. I first saw this on the Slack channel. Someone was reporting they couldn't pull our images from version 2.0.4, I think, upwards on their older Docker clients. Everything was fine on newer Docker clients, but older Docker clients just couldn't pull it. Later on, one of our enterprise customers moaned about it, but we'd already fixed it by then, so that was great. Now, the underlying issue was a change in some defaults that the GitHub action made. Recently, you can start pushing attestation and other kind of signatures to container registries. And the GitHub action underneath changed the defaults. There was a lot of problems with this, with various registries, lots of not just with us, all around these changes. It was even more frustrating because the change where they made the change in the default, it was just a minor version update, so Dependabot and other things just went, oh, it's just a minor version, whereas it should have been a major version because it broke quite a lot of things. And when he reported his failure, because it was on the version where we made that change and we'd had all these other problems, I immediately thought it might have been related. So there was quite a lot of debugging via curl of the registry endpoints, pulling different images, seeing what it responded, stuff like that. For those who don't know, container images can be in different formats, and there's schemas and specs for each different format. Unfortunately, when you push provenance signatures to it, it forces it into a more modern format, more recent format, and the older clients can't pull those. So we pushed an open source image just to test with this user that it worked. That was the problem. He confirmed it fixed it, so that unblocked him almost immediately. He had a big problem with, he had all this legacy estate, he needed these new containers on it, but he couldn't pull them without pulling them from another machine and then transferring them via tarballs. So it kind of unblocks him immediately. He raised the issue, got a pretty good response. I think 4 or 5 hours we got him a fix for it. And also for us, when our enterprise customer came along a few days later and moaned that their super secure stack couldn't pull images in modern formats, we could roll out the change pretty quickly. Well, in fact, I had rolled it out, and we just said, oh, yeah, we're already aware of this. Here's the fix. So I kind of wanted to touch on speed of response. If you're helping with open source or you're active in the community, you know who to ask, you can engage quite easily, and people respond to you. There's a lot of Slack questions. You'll get someone will join and almost immediately publish a question that's already been answered maybe, or is just straightforward. But if you've been on the community a while, people that know who you are, and they'll get a better feeling for you, and they'll be able to go, okay, I'm going to help this guy because I've chatted to him. I have a relationship with him as well. So it's really difficult to show this in slides. So here's the original Slack message 3 months ago. There we go. I think I took this screenshot the other day, and then there's some debugging of what figured it out. I pushed an image and made sure that he could then push it, because it looked like it was the solution, but ultimately we need him to test it. And this is a good thing with FluentBit, actually. We've got such a varied use case of people on different targets. It makes it a nightmare sometimes to support and test everything, but you've got a wide user space who will actively pull images and test things for you and go, yeah, it works in my very weird setup. So it solved that problem for me. Right, another problem we had, or a good reason for contributing to FluentBit, is new tech adoption. So FluentBit, we build everything on GitHub Actions. That's donated by Microsoft. But ARM builds have always been very slow. We build everything in containers, so we have quite a few different targets. I've covered various flavors of Ubuntu, Debian, CentOS, Raspbian, and the AMD 64, the ARM 64, and the ARM 32 variants of each of those. So everything's built in containers, so anyone can build it with some QEMU emulation. And it also means when we run it in GitHub, you've got the generic GitHub runner, it can build it as well. The problem we had was, so ARM builds were always slow because they're emulated. They were taking, the build should only be 4 or 5 minutes, taking an hour and a half. A lot of that was down to package install as well, because we have to add some dependencies and stuff like that. The Amazon Linux 2023 build for ARM started failing. It got to about 40% after 6 hours, which is the timeout for the GitHub action. You can't change that. So, and the change seems to be something in the base image. It was building before okay, and then it just started failing later on. We couldn't really change anything there. There's a lot of, if you're going to do ARM builds, you should do them on an ARM machine. Unfortunately, GitHub doesn't provide ARM machines. Self-hosted runners aren't recommended for public repos like open source projects, because there's lots of security problems. You can mitigate some of that, and you can manage it. But again, we're all open source. There's limited time we can spend on this. If we're having to manage infrastructure, come up with very complicated ways of solving simple problems, it's time we can't spend doing other things. And it's not very interesting for a lot of people, so it's difficult to get contribution on that. At one of the KubeCons, because we're there in our open source capacity, Actuated, Alex Ellis, who came up with, who's OpenFAS and a few other things as well, offered a solution for us using self-hosted runners that mitigates a lot of those problems, but it's very simple to use. So I thought, I'll give it a go. He was offering it to us for free to try out for the open source side, and he said, if Calypso pay for it, we'll let you have an equivalent amount for the open source as well. So there was, very simple effort to do. Thanks, I would like to think, largely to my refactoring of all the workflows to make it very straightforward. But it was very simple change for the actual code base. And infrastructure-wise, we just have to deploy the self-hosted runner, whack an agent on it with a key, done. So it's quite straightforward for people to maintain as we're going on in the future. So we had a big problem with build times. So even commercially, a lot of our Golang builds and other stuff was very, very slow. Well, too slow for testing and good turnaround. So we adopted it commercially as well. And there's some links to the various issues. Lots of people moaning because they wanted these builds, but they weren't available. Documentation and use cases. So there's a lot of questions around the same themes in Slack. So we try and improve the documentation, but if there's something that you guys are doing, find out, figure out, contribute the documentation update back as well. Contribute the use case. How are you using it? No one knows until you tell them. So it's useful to do that. And I started adding some blog posts and stuff like that, because then you could just respond to the same question with a direct link. And I would say documentation is the easiest way to contribute. You can correct things, you can add examples, and language reviews as well. We get a lot of developers who maybe English isn't their first language, and if you can do some language reviews on that, it's really helpful for everyone. They really appreciate it. I've touched on a couple here, adding some new examples, doing some minor corrections as well. So, my advice and suggestions on what you guys could all do to help contribute. Engage is the first one. Join in with the community, and sponsor if you can. Compute, resources, whatever is really helpful. Google sponsor quite a significant portion of our CI/CD, but not all of it. So we have to make that shortfall up somehow. Technical help, simplify. Triage issues, go through them, reproduce them, see if you can help users and maintainers. Document, add the missing or update incorrect information. Tests. There's never enough tests. People don't like writing tests. People like writing features and bugs and fixes. So add test case for your use cases, because it helps you as well. They'll be there in the future when someone makes a change and it fails in your particular use case. Triage, go through issues, try and help people out. It's really, a lot of the issues are, I haven't followed the template, so I haven't got the right amount of information, give me more information. And lastly, I would say is the last one is implement providing features or functionality. It's great to have, I won't say that, but I wanted to focus on some of the other ones and saying there's a lot of stuff you can do that's very simple, doesn't take a lot of amount of specific expertise or knowledge or time, but can improve the open source project and contribute and kind of help you as well a little bit. And also, please, for the love of God, if there's templates and contribution guides there, follow them. People get frustrated on both sides when they don't, and so just follow the issue and PR templates if they're available, or add them if they're not. That's super helpful. So you can contribute in various ways. Documentation, tests, support is the other one. So if you can support any open source projects or sponsor it, it'd be great. And it can benefit you commercially as well. There was a good SteamOS talk at Open Source Summit recently about how Valve are contributing back and how it actually helps them massively, making changes to the kernel to make Windows games run better, those kind of things. So yeah. Oh, and Cloud Native Manchester as well. If anyone wants to come, please come along. All right, that's it. Question?